Chapter 1. The Cold Trade. The city reeked of desperation. In the dim alleyways of the underworld, shadows moved with purpose. Whispers exchanged in hushed voices, and deals were sealed with nothing more than a touch. But here, currency wasn't gold or silver. It was emotion. Kael Varyn had long since forgotten what it meant to feel. He was a heart collector, one of the elite enforcers trained to extract emotions and sell them to the highest bidder. Love, fear, grief, pleasure, everything had value, and he was one of the best at what he did. Tonight was no different. A trembling man knelt before him, his body shaking as Kael pressed his gloved hand to his chest. The extraction process was swift, painless in the physical sense. But in seconds, the man's fear vanished, leaving him empty-eyed, hollow. He sagged to the ground, lifeless in everything but body. Kael exhaled, watching the glowing orb of emotion swirl between his fingers before he locked it into a small glass vial. Fear. It would fetch a decent price in the market. His work should have been over for the night. Yet, as he stepped into the bustling trade district, he felt it. Something he hadn't sensed in years. A pulse. A presence. Someone in this city felt too much. It was rare. Most people had been harvested so often that their emotions were dulled, nearly non-existent. But this was different. It was powerful. Raw. And for the first time in a long time, Kael Varyn felt something flicker deep inside his chest. Curiosity. He needed to find the source. Chapter 2. The empath Lyra moved through the marketplace like a ghost, careful not to meet anyone's gaze. Her emotions were her secret, her curse. She had learned long ago that in a world where feelings were currency, to feel deeply was dangerous. But she couldn't help it. She felt everything. The pain of a mother clutching her hungry child. The bitterness of a man who had lost too much. The hollow ache of a woman who remembered love but had it stolen from her. Lyra's heart was heavy with emotions that weren't even her own, but she carried them because it was the only way she knew how to survive. And that was her gift. Her curse. She could sense emotions, absorb them, hold them when others could not. It made her valuable. It made her a target. Kael watched her from the shadows, his gaze sharp, unyielding. There was no mistaking it. She was the source, the pulse that had drawn him in. She was different. Beautiful in a way that wasn't defined by symmetry or perfection, but by the quiet strength she carried, by the sadness she tried to hide behind her lowered lashes. And he wanted her. Not just for the value of her emotions, but for the mystery she presented. For the spark of curiosity she ignited in him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. But it wasn't just curiosity. It was hunger. It was a need he didn't yet understand. And it would destroy them both. Chapter 3. The encounter. She sensed him before she saw him. A shadow in the corner of her mind. A weight pressing against her soul. Danger. Darkness. When she turned, he was there. Watching. Waiting. "You're following me," she said. Her voice steady, though her heart raced beneath. Her ribs, Kael didn't deny it. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You feel more than you should." Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "You're mistaken." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her. "I don't make mistakes." Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. She could feel the storm brewing behind his eyes, a darkness that mirrored her own fear. Yet, beneath it all, there was something else, an understanding, a pull. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer still, his presence overwhelming. I don't know yet, but he would find out, even if it destroyed him. Chapter 4. The first touch. He found her again by the river, her fingers skimming the surface of the water, eyes distant. She didn't flinch when he approached, didn't run. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft. "It's dangerous." "I am dangerous." Their eyes met, and the air between them grew thick, heavy with tension. When his hand brushed hers, it wasn't by accident. The touch was light, but it burned, a fire beneath her skin. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. And for the first time, Kael wondered if it was possible for a collector to fall for the one thing he was meant to destroy. Chapter 5. Shadows of Desire. The nights in the Undercity were always heavy with danger, but tonight it felt different. The air crackled with something unseen, a tension that clung to the skin. Lyra sat near the low burning fire, her eyes tracing the shadows that danced along the cavern walls. She could feel Kael's gaze on her, heavy and unreadable. He stood against the far side of the room, arms crossed, watching her as though she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. His presence was sharp, magnetic, the kind of presence that pulled like gravity. "You're staring," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. Kael didn't move, didn't even blink. "You're dangerous," he murmured. Lyra glanced up, her brow furrowing. "I'm the one who should be afraid." He pushed off the wall, slow, deliberate. The way a predator might stalk its prey, not out of malice, but inevitability. He moved closer, every step echoing in the silence. Lyra's heart stuttered in her chest, her fingers clenching in her lap. Kael stopped just a breath away, close, enough that she could feel the heat of him, the restrained intensity simmering beneath his skin. "You make me weak," he said, voice low and rough. "And weakness is dangerous." Lyra swallowed, her throat dry. "Then why do you stay?" A flicker crossed his face, something vulnerable, something raw. "Because I'm already yours." The words lingered, in the air, heavy and irreversible. Lyra's breath caught, her emotions tangling in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She wanted to pull away, but her body betrayed her, leaning closer, drawn by the gravity of him. But Kael stopped her, his hand ghosting along her cheek, fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "Not yet," he whispered. "You deserve more than shadows and stolen moments." And just like that, he stepped back, retreating into the darkness that seemed to follow him, leaving her aching, wanting. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. Lyra sat by the dying embers of the fire long after Kael had disappeared, into the shadows. The heat of his words still lingered on her skin, like a brand she couldn't shake. Not yet. The promise of something, but also the denial. It left her restless, her mind a storm of emotions she could barely contain. Why did he hold back? Why? When every glance, every touch, burned with something undeniable? She stood, needing the cool air to calm her. The Undercity was quiet now, the traders and shadow dwellers hidden away. She stepped outside, into the labyrinth of dark alleys, and leaned against the cold stone wall. Her heart still raced, her body still attuned to him, even though he wasn't there. And then, she felt him. Before she saw him, she sensed him. Kael's presence was impossible to ignore. He emerged from the dark like smoke, silent and sure, his gaze burning into hers. "I shouldn't be here," he said. But his feet didn't move, didn't take him away. Lyra's breath was shallow. "Then why are you?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. His eyes, dark, endless, searched hers. And then he was there, towering over her, close enough that his breath ghosted across her skin. "Because I can't stay away from you." The words hit her like a blow. She trembled, but not from fear, not from cold. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. A simple touch, but it sent fire through her veins. She pressed into it, seeking something she didn't fully understand. "Kael," she whispered. But the word faltered on her lips. His fingers slid to the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing her jaw. "If you knew the things I've done, you wouldn't let me this close. But you are this close," she said, voice trembling. "And I'm not moving." For a moment, the world stilled. The distant hum of the city faded. There was only the sound of their breathing, the quiet tension crackling between them. And then, Kael pressed his forehead against hers, his voice a broken rasp. "You undo me." His lips brushed hers, just a ghost of a kiss, nothing more. But it was enough to unravel her, enough to leave her trembling, enough to leave her wanting. But again, he pulled away, leaving her standing there, clutching the stone wall for balance, her body still aching for the touch he wouldn't give her. Chapter 7. Shadows between us. The silence after Kael's departure was louder than any scream. Lyra stood alone, her body still humming with the echo of his nearness, her skin burning where his fingers had traced. She wanted to curse him. She wanted to chase after him. But instead, she stood there, trembling, wanting. It was a dangerous thing, this pull between them. In a world where emotions were currency, she had none to spare. But Kael, he made her want to risk it all. The next day dawned cold and gray. The Undercity was already awake, shadows moving beneath shadows. Lyra pulled her hood low, weaving through the narrow alleys. She should have been thinking about survival, about the next trade, the next step. But all she could think about was him. And then, like fate was taunting her, there he was. Kael stood beneath the arch of a ruined bridge, arms crossed, watching her with that dark, unreadable gaze. She stopped, her breath hitching. "Why are you following me?" He didn't move. "Maybe I'm protecting you." "I don't need protection." His lips twitched, half a smile, half something darker. "No. You just need someone to stop you from doing something foolish." She stepped closer, defiant. "And what if I already have?" His eyes burned into hers. "Then I'd have to decide what's worth protecting more, you, or my own heart." The words struck deep, cutting through her defenses like a blade. "I'm not yours to protect," she said softly. "You can't have me, Kael." Something dark flickered in his gaze, a storm held barely in check. He stepped closer, their bodies nearly touching, his voice a low growl. "I already do." The tension snapped like a whip. Lyra's breath caught, her pulse a frantic drumbeat. She didn't know if she wanted to run or fall into him. But then, before she could speak, his hand lifted. Not to touch her, not to pull her closer, but to hand her something. A small, glowing vial. Her heart, the one emotion he'd taken from her when they first met, the one thing that could undo her. "I kept it safe," he said, his voice rough, almost broken. "Because I knew I couldn't let it go." Lyra stared, torn between fear and longing. And before she could think better of it, her hand reached out, fingers brushing his. The moment their skin touched, the world tilted. The emotion inside the vial pulsed, warm, fierce, alive. Just like her, and maybe just like him. Chapter 8. The Edge of Wanting. The vial in Lyra's hand was deceptively small, but the weight of it pressed down on her like 1,000 chains. Her own heart, her own emotions, everything she had once felt, sealed away in Kael's hands. She should have been furious. She should have smashed it against the ground and walked away. But she didn't. Instead, she lifted her gaze to his, her fingers tightening around the glass. "Why?" she whispered. "Why give this back to me now?" Kael's expression darkened, unreadable. "Because it's yours." Her breath hitched. "You could have sold it." "I could have." He took a step closer, his presence wrapping around her like something tangible, something dangerous. "I should have." The air between them was thick, charged with something she wasn't ready to name. Kael lifted a hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was barely there, but it sent a shiver down her spine. His fingers lingered for a second too long before he pulled back. "You think I don't know what it means to want something I shouldn't?" His voice was rough, edged with something raw. "But I couldn't let go of this. Of you." Lyra's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take the vial, to press it to her chest and feel everything she had lost. But the fear held her still. Because if she let herself feel again, if she let him in, what then? What would be left of her when he was gone? Kael seemed to sense the war inside her. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tight. "You don't have to take it back." "Not yet." Her heart twisted painfully. "And if I never do?" Something in his gaze flickered, something she almost missed. Hurt. But he didn't show it. Instead, he took a step back, the space between them stretching like an open wound. "Then, I'll hold on to it." His voice was quiet but firm. "Until you're ready." Lyra wanted to tell him she never would be, that it was too dangerous. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down she already knew the truth. She was already his, with or without the vial. Would you like to see the stakes rise in the next chapter, perhaps? An outside force threatening their fragile connection, or Lyra making a desperate decision? Chapter 9. The Price of Feeling. Lyra's hands trembled as she tucked the vial into the folds of her cloak. She wasn't ready to break it open, to let all those locked-away emotions rush back in. But she also couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. Kael watched her with something unreadable in his expression, but he said nothing. Maybe he understood that this was a battle she had to fight alone. The streets of the underground market bustled around them, a current of desperate traders and hollow-eyed buyers searching for pieces of themselves they had long sold away. Emotions were currency here. Bottled rage, distilled sorrow, the fleeting warmth of love. And in the center of it all, the syndicate ruled. "We need to move," Kael said, his voice low. "I traded my last favor to get us out of the city unnoticed, but it won't last long." Lyra nodded, forcing herself to focus. She followed him through the labyrinth of alleys, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and the acrid tang of burning memories, remnants of stolen emotions too tainted to be sold. They were nearly free of the market when a voice stopped them cold. "Leaving so soon, Kael?" Both of them froze. Lyra turned slowly, her pulse hammering in her throat. Man leaned against the entrance to the alley, his smile sharp as a blade. His coat was lined with silver clasps, the mark of a high-ranking collector, and his gaze settled on Kael like a predator that had already sunk its teeth in. "Lucian," Kael muttered, his hand already drifting toward the knife at his belt. Lyra had never met him, but she knew the name. Kael's former partner, the man who had betrayed him. Lucian's eyes flicked to her, curiosity sparking in their depths. "Ah, so this is the girl." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I should have known." You always had a weakness for things you couldn't keep. Kael's grip on the knife tightened. What do you want? Lucian sighed theatrically. Come now, you already know. His gaze darkened. You stole from the syndicate. And we can't have that, can we? Lyra's stomach twisted. She knew what he meant. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the stolen vials Kael had hoarded over the years. It was her. Kael had stolen her heart, her emotions, the very thing that made her a rarity in this broken world, and the syndicate wanted her back. Lucian smiled, slow and cruel. Hand her over and I'll let you walk away. Lyra didn't dare look at Kael. She didn't want to see the choice he had to make. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady. Over my dead body. Lucian sighed. I was hoping you'd say that. Then the alley exploded into chaos. Would you like the next chapter to focus on the fight and their escape? Or should I dive into an emotional moment between them in the aftermath? Chapter 10. Blood and Betrayal. The moment Lucian moved, Kael was already ahead of him. He shoved Lyra back just as the first knife sliced through the air, barely missing his shoulder. The alley erupted into chaos, figures emerging from the shadows, mercenaries in syndicate black, their faces unreadable beneath their hoods. A trap. Kael didn't hesitate. He lunged, his blade flashing in the dim light, catching the nearest attacker in the throat. A spray of crimson painted the cobblestones, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her breath ragged. She wasn't. Useless. She had spent her life surviving. But against trained killers, she was no match. Lucian was watching her. Even as Kael tore through the mercenaries with ruthless efficiency, Lucian remained still, his smile never faltering. He was waiting. For her. Lyra's fingers tightened around the vial hidden in her cloak. She didn't know what was inside. The emotions Kael had stolen for her. The ones that had once belonged to her before they were ripped away. But she had no choice. She pulled it free. The glass felt delicate, fragile, as she raised it to her lips and bit down. It shattered between her teeth. And then, pain. A tidal wave of sensation crashed through her, raw and violent. Memories surged forward, laughter that once belonged to her, grief so deep it stole her breath, love so powerful it nearly crushed her. She felt again. Lucian's expression finally shifted, his smile disappearing as he took an instinctive step back. What did you do? Lyra lifted her gaze, and for the first time in years, her heart burned in her chest like a living thing. She wasn't weak anymore. She moved before she could think, grabbing a fallen dagger, her muscles reacting to instincts she hadn't known she still possessed. Lucian barely had time to block before she struck. A sharp clang echoed through the alley as their blades met. Lyra gritted her teeth, pushing forward with everything she had. She wasn't trained like Kael, but she had something Lucian didn't expect, reckless desperation. Lucian stumbled, eyes flashing with fury. He didn't get to finish. Kael was there in an instant, his knife slamming into Lucian's gut. Lucian gasped, eyes wide, blood bubbling at his lips. Kael twisted the blade. Stay dead this time. Then he let him fall. The remaining mercenaries hesitated, seeing their leader on the ground, his breath rattling, his life slipping away. Kael didn't give them time to recover. He grabbed Lyra's hand. Run! They bolted, weaving through the labyrinth of alleys, shadows and shouts chasing after them. Lyra's legs burned, her chest tight with emotion and exhaustion, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. By the time they reached the outskirts of the underground, her body ached, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter. Kael pulled her into a darkened doorway, his breaths coming fast. His grip on her wrist was tight, grounding. She turned to him, still trembling. I felt everything. He met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. I know. She searched his face. Kael, what if... His hand cupped her cheek, silencing her. His thumb brushed against her skin, tracing a path she didn't understand. You're alive, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Lyra swallowed hard. And you saved me. Kael's lips curled, but there was no humor in it. No, you saved yourself. She didn't know who moved first. All she knew was that when his lips met hers, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate, raw, the taste of blood, and adrenaline mixing with something deeper, something neither of them could explain. Chapter 11. The price of a heart. Kael's kiss was not careful. It was demanding, consuming, an unspoken declaration of everything he could not say. Lyra melted against him, her body still trembling from the rush of emotions flooding her senses. For the first time in years, she felt. Every touch, every stolen breath, every beat of her heart crashing against her ribs like a storm. But then Kael pulled away. His forehead rested against hers, his breath uneven. We need to move, he murmured, his fingers still gripping her waist. Lyra swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. He was right. They weren't safe. Not yet. She nodded, stepping back even as the absence of his warmth left her cold. Where do we go? Kael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. There's a place beyond the city, a sanctuary, hidden from the syndicate. If we can get there, we might have a chance. Lyra glanced behind them. The underground was no longer safe, not with Lucien's mercenaries hunting them. Then let's go. They moved quickly, navigating through the darkened streets. The city was alive in the distance, its towering spires gleaming beneath artificial light. But Lyra's focus was on Kael. There was something different about him. The way he held himself, the way his gaze flickered between her and their surroundings, as if calculating 1,000 possible threats. She knew what he had done. He had killed Lucien. And yet, Lyra felt no guilt. No remorse, only relief. It scared her. How easily she could accept that. Kael, she whispered as they slipped into the shadows of an abandoned building. Lucien said something before he died. He said you had a secret. Kael tensed. She caught the flicker of hesitation in his eyes before he turned away. That doesn't matter now. But it did matter. Because the way he said it, the way his voice wavered just slightly, told her that whatever he was hiding was bigger than she had imagined. Before she could press further, a distant sound made them both freeze. Footsteps. Heavy. Unrelenting. The syndicate was coming. Kael grabbed her hand. Run! They bolted through the ruins, weaving through collapsed buildings and rusted metal. Lyra's lungs burned, her legs screaming for rest, but she didn't slow down. Not when she heard the gunfire. Not when she felt the bullet tear past her shoulder, missing by mere inches. She stumbled, but Kael was there, catching her, pulling her forward. Keep moving, he growled. They burst into the open, the city walls looming in the distance. Freedom was so close. But then, a figure stepped into their path. A man clad in syndicate armor, his face hidden beneath a steel mask. Kael cursed under his breath, shoving Lyra behind him. Stay back. The man tilted his head. Kael. The voice was cold, familiar. Lyra's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was the same one that had haunted her nightmares. The same one that had ordered her heart to be stolen all those years ago. The voice of the man who had taken everything from her. And now he was here, waiting, smiling, as if he had known they would come. Chapter 12. The man behind the mask Kael's grip on Lyra tightened. His body tensed like a predator ready to strike, but Lyra could feel the shift in his energy, a hesitation, a flicker of something dangerous beneath his rage. The masked man took a slow step forward, the metal of his armor gleaming under the dim light. "Did you really think you could run forever, Kael?" His voice was smooth, deliberate. "Did you think I wouldn't find you?" Kael's jaw clenched. "I should have known you'd crawl out of the shadows eventually." Lyra's mind raced. This wasn't just a random syndicate officer. The way he spoke, the way Kael stood so still, like he was staring at a ghost. This man was someone from Kael's past. The man turned his gaze to her, studying her with unnerving patience. And this must be the girl, he mused. The one who still feels. Lyra swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. Kael took a step in front of her, shielding her from the man's scrutiny. "If you lay a single hand on her, I will kill you." The masked figure chuckled, as if amused. "You say that like you haven't already killed for her." He tilted his head. "Like you didn't become exactly what I made you to be." Lyra felt Kael go rigid. The world seemed to slow. Kael's past was a mystery, shrouded in secrets he refused to share. But now, as he stood before this man, the pieces began to fall into place. "You trained him," Lyra whispered, realization dawning. The man turned to her, pleased. "Smart girl." He lifted his mask just enough for her to see his mouth. A smirk curved his lips. "I didn't just train him, I created him." Kael's breathing was heavy. His fingers twitched at his sides, as if resisting the urge to lunge. "You're nothing to me, Marius." Marius. The name sent a shiver down Lyra's spine. Kael had never spoken about his past, only that he had escaped the syndicate, that he had done things he wasn't proud of. And now, standing before them, was the man who had shaped him into whatever monster he feared becoming. Marius sighed. "Kael, Kael, Kael." He sounded almost disappointed. "I trained you to survive, and yet here you are, running for a girl, risking everything for something as useless as love." Kael didn't answer, because in that moment, Marius moved. Faster than Lyra could react, he pulled a blade from his belt and lunged at Kael. Kael met him head-on. The clash of metal rang through the air as their weapons collided. Kael shoved Marius back, his movements sharp, controlled. But Marius was just as fast, just as lethal. Lyra stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had to help, but how? Then she saw it, a gun strapped to Marius's side. Without thinking, she darted forward. Marius twisted just in time to see her coming. A cruel smile crossed his lips. "Oh, sweetheart." Lyra grabbed the gun and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the empty streets. Marius staggered back, a growl of pain tearing from his throat. The bullet had grazed his side, not enough to kill, but enough to slow him down. Kael didn't hesitate. He drove his knife into Marius's shoulder, pinning him against the wall. Blood dripped onto the pavement. Marius gritted his teeth, his breathing uneven. "You think this changes anything?" He chuckled, low and dark. "You can't outrun the syndicate, Kael." His eyes flickered to Lyra. "And you can't protect her forever." Kael twisted the blade, and Marius let out a sharp hiss. "I can try." With that, Kael ripped the knife free, and Marius crumpled to the ground. Kael grabbed Lyra's wrist. "We need to go. Now." They didn't look back. As they ran, Lyra's heart pounded, not just from adrenaline, but from the truth she had seen in Kael's eyes. Marius wasn't just an enemy. He was a part of Kael's past that would never stop, hunting them. Chapter 13. The Cost of Freedom. The night swallowed them whole as Kael pulled Lyra through the labyrinth of darkened streets. His grip on her wrist was firm, almost desperate. Blood, Marius's blood, still stained the knife clutched in his other hand. Lyra's breath came in ragged gasps. She didn't ask where they were going. She trusted him. But the weight of what had just happened pressed heavy against her ribs. Kael had stabbed the man who trained him, the man who had made him, and Marius wasn't dead. When they finally stopped in a secluded alleyway, Kael released her. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Are you hurt?" Lyra shook her head. "No." He turned away, bracing, his hands against the wall. His shoulders were tense, his entire body wound tight like a spring ready to snap. "We need to leave the city," he said, voice clipped. "Now." Lyra hesitated. Kael, his head snapped up. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something raw, something haunted. "You don't understand," he said. "Marius doesn't give up, ever. He's going to come. After us. And next time, he won't be alone." She swallowed hard. "Then we fight." Kael let out a hollow laugh. "You think we can fight the Syndicate? They own this world. The only reason we're still breathing is because Marius wants us to be. He's playing with us, Lyra." His words sent a chill down her spine. "We can't just run forever," she argued. "There has to be another way." Kael turned to face her fully now, stepping closer. The dim light carved shadows across his sharp features, making him look even more dangerous than usual. "Tell me, Lyra," he murmured, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "Are you willing to risk your life for this? For me?" The question hung between them, unspoken but heavy. Lyra didn't look away. "I already have." Something flickered across his face. Surprise. Something deeper. Something vulnerable. Then, before she could react, he reached for her. His fingers skimmed her jaw, his touch both rough and reverent. His forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "I don't deserve you." Lyra lifted a hand, placing it over his. "That's not your choice to make." For a moment, he just stood there, like he was memorizing the feel of her. Then, with a sigh, he pulled back. "We need to move." She nodded. "Where?" Kael's jaw tightened. "There's only one place left." Lyra frowned. "Where?" His expression darkened. "The black market." Her stomach dropped. The black market was more than just an underground trading hub. It was where the most dangerous people in the world gathered. Smugglers, mercenaries, bounty hunters, and Kael was about to lead her straight into the lion's den. Chapter 14. Into the lion's den. The black market was a place of shadows and whispered deals, a city beneath the city where the desperate and the dangerous thrived. Kael pulled Lyra deeper into the underground tunnels, their footsteps echoing softly on damp stone. The air smelled of rust and decay, a sharp contrast to the golden glow of lanterns flickering in the distance. She had heard of this place in hushed warnings, where emotions were bought and sold, where people with rare abilities vanished without a trace. Now she was walking straight into it. Kael's grip on her wrist tightened. "Stay close. Keep your head down. No matter what happens, don't speak unless I tell you to." She swallowed and nodded. As they emerged into the heart of the market, Lyra's breath caught. Rows of stalls lined the cavernous space, merchants peddling everything from stolen artifacts to vials of bottled emotions, fear, joy, rage. She watched as a man exchanged a vial of love for a stack of credits, his face turning blank the moment it left his hands. It was horrifying. Kael led her toward a dimly lit corridor, stopping outside a rusted metal door. He knocked once. A slit in the door slid open, revealing a pair of cold, calculating eyes. "Kael." The voice was deep, almost amused. "Didn't think I'd see you crawling back here." The door creaked open, revealing a man draped in dark robes, his face lined with scars. "Orion," Kael said stiffly. "We need safe passage out of the city." Orion's gaze flickered to Lyra. His lips curled into a slow smirk. "And what do we have? Here?" Kael stepped in front of her. "She's not for sale." Orion chuckled. "Relax. But a favor like this, Kael, it'll cost you." Kael exhaled sharply. "Name it." Orion's smirk widened. "A trade." His eyes gleamed. "Give me a piece of your heart." Lyra froze. Kael stiffened beside her, his jaw clenching. "You know what that means," Orion added, his voice dripping with amusement. "Just a sliver, and you can walk out of here with your pretty little friend." Lyra's stomach twisted. The trade of emotions was common here, but this, asking for a part of Kael's very soul, was beyond cruel. "Kael, no," she whispered, but he was already reaching for the knife at his belt. Before she could stop him, he dragged the blade across his palm. A thin line of silver energy pooled in his hand, a fragment of his heart, his very essence. He clenched his fist, eyes burning with defiance. "Take it." Orion grinned, plucking the glowing energy from Kael's palm with a single, greedy motion. Kael staggered slightly, his face pale. Lyra caught his arm. "Are you—" "I'm fine." He cut her off, his voice rough. Orion pocketed the fragment with satisfaction. "Deal's done. You leave by sunrise." Kael nodded, pulling Lyra away before she could say another word. As they disappeared into the market's maze, Lyra felt Kael sway slightly. "You gave him a piece of yourself," she murmured. Kael let out a bitter laugh. "It was never mine to keep anyway." But Lyra wasn't fooled. She knew the truth. No matter how much Kael pretended to be unshaken, he had just given up something he could never get back. And now, she was more determined than ever. She wouldn't let him keep sacrificing himself for her. Because for the first time in her life, she realized something terrifying. She would burn the world down before she let Kael lose himself. Chapter 15. The Price of Sacrifice. Kael barely made it out of the black market before his legs gave. Out, Lyra caught him before he hit the ground. "Kael!" Her voice was laced with panic as she knelt beside him, his weight pressing against her. His skin was clammy, his breathing uneven. He had given Orion a sliver of his heart, more than just an emotion. It was a piece of his very existence, a wound that couldn't be seen but was bleeding all the same. "I'm fine," he muttered, trying to push himself up. She tightened her grip. "Liar," Kael smirked weakly. "You're learning." But there was no amusement in his voice. They were hidden in the shadows of a crumbling alleyway, far enough from the market to be unseen, but not far enough for Lyra to feel safe. She scanned their surroundings, her heart beat loud in her ears. "How do we fix this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Kael closed his eyes for a brief moment, then exhaled sharply. "We don't." Lyra's stomach twisted. "That can't be true. There has to be a way to—" "Stop." His eyes snapped open, burning into hers. "You don't understand what I gave up, Lyra. You can't just put it back." "But—" He grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. "Promise me you won't go back to him. Promise me you won't try to bargain with Orion for something that can't be undone." Lyra hesitated. She didn't want to make a promise she couldn't keep. Kael's expression softened. "Please." She swallowed hard, then nodded. "I promise." Flicker of relief crossed his face before he slumped against the wall. Lyra shifted closer, placing her hands on either side of his face. "You need to rest." He let out a breathy laugh. I need a drink. She rolled her eyes. You need sleep, Kael. Fine, he murmured. But only if you stay close. Her pulse stuttered. Why? His fingers brushed against her wrist, tracing slow, deliberate circles. Because if I wake up and you're gone, I will burn this entire city to the ground. Lyra exhaled shakily. You're impossible. His smirk was lazy, tired. And you're still here. She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she pulled him closer, letting him rest against her shoulder. As his breathing evened out, she realized something terrifying. She was falling for the heart collector. And if she wasn't careful, she'd give him more than just a sliver of her heart. She'd give him everything. Chapter 16. A heart for a heart, Lyra didn't sleep. She sat against the cold stone wall of the alley, Kael's weight pressing into her side, his slow and steady breaths the only indication that he was still alive. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted, but he was warm. Warmer than she expected for someone who had just lost a piece of himself. She had never seen him like this before. Vulnerable, mortal. The thought unsettled her. Kael had always seemed untouchable, like a shadow that slipped through cracks in the world, an enigma that no blade could wound, no force could break. But here he was, his body weak, his heart fractured. And he had done it for her. Lyra clenched her fists. This was her fault. She should have run when she had the chance. She should have never let him get close. Because now, the thought of losing him made her stomach twist painfully. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a brief moment, just long enough to steady herself. Then Kael stirred. You're awake, she said softly. His lips twitched into a ghost of a smirk. I'd say good morning, but I doubt anything about this situation is good, she huffed. That depends. Are you planning on dying today? He winced as he sat up. Not if I can help it. Relief loosened the tight knot in her chest. Good, she muttered, looking away. Kael studied her, his sharp eyes lingering too long. Lyra, he said, his voice softer than usual. She didn't want to look at him, didn't want to see whatever emotion was flickering behind his dark gaze. But he didn't let her escape. Fingers brushed against her chin, tilting her face toward his. Tell me what you're thinking. She swallowed. I think you're a fool. A low chuckle rumbled from his chest. Not the first time I've heard that. You shouldn't have given Orion anything, she whispered. Not for me. His smirk faded. I would do it again, he said simply. Her breath caught. Kael, I meant what I said before, Lyra. You make me feel things I shouldn't. Things I thought I'd lost a long time ago. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, slow and deliberate. And I would rather give up pieces of myself than let this world take you from me. Her heart pounded. You're an idiot, she whispered. Perhaps. His voice was low, rough. But I'm your idiot now. Her pulse stuttered as his lips brushed hers. Not quite a kiss, not quite a tease. Just a taste, a warning, a promise. Then he pulled back, his smirk returning. We should get moving before someone tries to kill us again. Lyra exhaled shakily. She didn't know what terrified her more, the danger outside these alley walls or the way Kael was unraveling the carefully built walls around her heart. Chapter 17. The Price of Love, Lyra. And Kael didn't have time to dwell on unspoken words. The underworld was already shifting, whispering, searching for them. The city's heartbeat pulsed with danger, and every shadow felt like an enemy waiting to strike. They needed to leave. Kael pushed himself to his feet, wincing as he adjusted to the weight of his injury. Lyra caught his arm before he could stumble. "You're not in any shape to fight," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. His smirk was lazy, but didn't reach his eyes. "Since when has that stopped me?" She rolled her eyes but didn't let go of him. "Where do we go?" Kael's jaw tightened. "We need to get to the inner sanctum before Orion does." Her stomach twisted. The inner sanctum, the heart of the city, where the most powerful heart collectors gathered. A place where love was a currency more valuable than gold, and where people like them were nothing more than pawns in a deadly game. "Why? There?" she asked, suspicion lacing her voice. "Because Orion isn't just looking for me," Kael said grimly. "He's looking for you." Lyra stiffened. Kael's fingers brushed her wrist in a fleeting touch. "You don't understand how rare you are, Lyra. A woman who can feel, who still holds her emotions untouched. It's unheard of in this world." She swallowed hard. "So what? He wants to." "Take my heart too?" Kael's expression darkened. "Not just take it. Use it. A heart like yours could rewrite the rules of the trade. Whoever owns it, owns everything." A shiver ran down her spine. She had spent her life trying to survive, trying to remain unseen. But now the most dangerous man in the underworld wanted her, not for who she was, but for what she was. "Then we don't let him have me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling inside her. Kael's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. "I won't let him." A promise, a vow, a dangerous truth. But Lyra knew better than to trust promises in a world like this. They moved through the city like ghosts, slipping through the cracks before anyone could notice them. Kael was slower than usual, his movements stiff, his breath uneven. The wound Orion had inflicted was still draining him. It didn't matter how strong he pretended to be. He wasn't invincible. They reached the outskirts of the inner sanctum just as the first traces of dawn bled into the sky. The towering gates loomed before them, guarded by men who had traded their emotions for power, their hearts long since sold to the highest bidder. Kael's fingers curled around Lyra's wrist, pulling her close. "Once we step inside, everything changes," he murmured. "Are you ready for that?" Lyra looked up at him, at the man who had once been nothing more than a hunter in the dark. Now he was something more, something she couldn't bear to lose. She exhaled slowly. "As long as you're with me." His smirk softened, something raw flickering in his eyes. "Always." And with that, they stepped into the lion's den. Continue Chapter 18. The Final Gamble. The inner sanctum was nothing like the decayed streets of the lower city. Here, opulence masked corruption, and power dripped from every corner. Golden lanterns bathed the marble halls in warm light, but Lyra could feel the coldness beneath it all. This was where love was sold, where emotions were drained, where souls were auctioned to the highest bidder. Kael's grip on her wrist was firm, a silent anchor in the storm. His face was unreadable, but she felt the tension in his body, the way his muscles coiled as if expecting a fight. And he was right to, because Orion was waiting for them. At the far end of the hall, standing before a throne carved from black stone, Orion watched them with a knowing smirk. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," he said lazily. "But then again, you always were predictable, Kael." Kael didn't rise to the bait. His voice was cold. "Let her go." Orion's gaze flickered, to Lyra, then back to Kael. "Let her go." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you? She's not just some girl. She's the key." Lyra's pulse pounded. "The key to what?" she demanded. Orion's smirk widened. "To breaking the system." Silence hung heavy between them. Kael's grip on her wrist tightened. Orion stepped forward, his sharp eyes gleaming. The heart trade exists because emotions are rare. People can't feel anymore, not the way they used to. But you, Lyra, he tilted his head. You're different. Your heart, if harvested, could reset everything. If I had it, I could control every emotion in this city. Make people love who I want them to love. Make them bow. A chill ran down her spine. You're insane, she whispered. Orion smiled. No, darling. I'm a visionary. Kael took a step forward, his body tense with barely restrained fury. You're not touching her. Orion sighed, as if disappointed. I was hoping you'd see reason, Kael. You could have had a place at my side, but instead, you let yourself feel. His eyes darkened. And for that, you've already lost. Lyra barely had time to react before Orion's guards lunged forward. Kael shoved her behind him, drawing his blade in one swift motion. The clash of metal echoed through the hall as he fought them off, his movements sharp despite his injury. But there were too many. A hand yanked Lyra backward. She gasped, struggling against the grip of one of Orion's men. No! Kael turned at the sound of her voice, just in time to see Orion raise a dagger toward her chest. Something snapped inside him. With a roar, Kael broke free from the guards, ignoring the pain in his side as he lunged at Orion. Their blades met, sparks flying, but Kael was faster, stronger, fueled by something more powerful than hate. He didn't fight for revenge, he fought for her. With a final brutal strike, Kael drove his sword through Orion's chest. Orion's eyes widened in shock, blood staining his lips as he staggered back. His fingers trembled as he clutched the blade, as if trying to understand how he had lost. You fool, he rasped. You could have ruled. Kael ripped the sword free. I don't need power. Orion collapsed too, the ground lifeless. The remaining guards hesitated, then fled. Silence settled over the hall. Lyra was breathing hard, her heart racing as she turned to Kael. He was swaying slightly, blood dripping from the wound in his side, but his eyes were only on her. She ran, to him, catching him before he could fall. You're bleeding, she said, panic rising in her throat. Kael gave her a lopsided smirk. I've had worse. Tears burned in her eyes. You almost died. His smirk faded. He lifted a hand to her cheek, his touch gentle despite the chaos around them. But I didn't. His voice was softer now. Because I couldn't leave you. A sob escaped her lips. And before she could think, before she could second guess, she kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was desperate. Fierce. A collision of emotions that neither of them could contain any longer. Kael groaned, into her mouth, his hands tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer. The world around them was crumbling, but they had won. And for the first time, in a city where hearts were nothing but currency, Lyra had found hers.